As you may know, Apple has created a walled garden around iOS development. If you're going to build an app for the iPhone, you must use Apple-designated hardware in order to do so. And when it comes to the actual assembly of the app, a lot of engineering teams offload that work to a server farm. Interestingly enough, those server farms are racks loaded up with Mac Minis. These Mac Minis just sit there, they're headless. They sit there idling, waiting for tasks to be thrown at them, and they ingest them, crank it out, and move on to the next task. I have not heard of many companies using the server version of the Mac Pro for this task. In some cases, Android apps are also built on this hardware, though Android doesn't really care where you build it. It can be Linux, Chromebook, Windows, even your smart fridge could probably assemble an APK. So when Apple announced the Mac Studio this past week, the very first thing I began to wonder was, how is this going to impact our Mac Mini server farms? One thing I've been thinking about since the announcement of the Mac Studio with M1 Ultra chip is how it's going to impact app developers. When large-scale organizations build the app that goes up to the storefront, they're not doing it on dev hardware. They use a process called CI/CD, which verifies the code, runs tests against it, and then cranks out a build that can be taken and installed on your phone. Why? Because engineers are lazy. We don't want to go through the process of something that otherwise could be automated. These headless Mac Minis go through just that. They run verification checks, they check our code, they check for best practices, and then eventually they turn out something called a release candidate. Mobile app development runs these Mac Minis into the ground. These headless little machines just sit there idling all day and night, waiting for devs to push tasks up to them to be completed automatically. Or the Mac Minis will also yell at us for writing bad code. So what's the big deal with these Mac Studios, and why am I so excited about them? Well, for one, Apple intentionally decided to cool the Mac Studio from the rear, which primes it just like the Mac Mini to be mounted on a server rack. And for many large-scale operations, the app itself, when being built, requires a lot of memory in order to be assembled. So long ago, like a year ago, Apple made a very intentional move with the Mac Mini. They decided to stop pretending that the Mac Minis were good enough for enterprise-level application development. It's true though, on paper, the i7 that you can pack into one of those form factors along with 64 gigs of RAM sounds great on paper. However, it's a thermal nightmare. And all that power with all of that heat and that tiny form factor was just a stopgap solution while Apple worked on rolling out their new silicon. And the proof is in the lineup. The new Mac Mini only supports the base M1 chip and 16 gigs of RAM. It has been dethroned. It is a casual computing machine. For reference, one of the apps that I work on right now requires 24 gigs of RAM in order to build. The new M1 Mac Mini with 16 gigs of RAM will compile that project, but it will do so inefficiently by swapping memory to disk. Now you might be asking yourself, why not just stick with the Intel-based Mac Minis? Well, actually, that sounds great on paper, but anyone who maintains CI/CD systems knows getting as close to the architecture on actual dev machines is always the best approach. And devs across the globe are flocking to the new MacBook Pros with the M1 Pro and M1 Max chip in order to deliver the next generation of apps. Deterministic is a great engineering keyword here. It means for every input, I should get the same exact output every single time. So the best move here for automation is to move over to Apple Silicon. So the Mac Mini is out, and that is why I'm so excited about the Mac Studio. With the Mac Studio, I can set up a server rack with just 4 Mac Studios and achieve significantly more computing power than 12 Mac Minis for the same exact footprint. Here's how. Let's take a Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra chip, 128 gigs of RAM, and a 1 terabyte SSD. I install a very popular Jenkins build agent on that Mac Studio to set it up as a headless node, and then I separate it into 5 separate virtual machines. Why 5, you may be asking? 128 gigs available on that machine divided by 24 gigs, which my project needs in order to compile, comes out a little over 5. So rounding down, I chose 5 virtual machines, or 5 build agents. Interestingly enough, the Mac Studio has the exact same footprint as the Mac Mini. It's about 8 by 8 inches, and it's significantly taller than the Mac Mini at 3.7 inches. This means the smallest rack size I can use to support a Mac Studio is a 3U rack size, which comes in a little over 5 inches tall. And because the Mac Mini and the Mac Studio have the exact same footprint, we know we can support up to 4 units per standard rack. So that's 4 Mac Studios, each with 5 build agents each. That's a total of 20 build agents available for me to build on, all with enough RAM to support my project. Now let's take a look at the standard Mac Mini rack setup. So the Mac Mini and the Mac Studio have the exact same footprint. We know we can support up to 4 on a single rack with the Mac Mini. But because the height of the Mac Mini is significantly shorter than the Studio, we only need 1 U of vertical space to hold those 4 Mac Minis. Okay, so now we have some numbers to work with. A single layer rack can hold up to 4 Mac Minis, whereas we need 3 rack layers in order to support 4 Mac Studios. So if we fill the difference in vertical space, matching 1 for 1, we can actually fill up 2 additional layers with Mac Minis, which means we can support up to 12 Mac Minis for the same footprint as 4 Mac Studios. Isn't figuring this kind of thing out fun? Make sure you press that like button if you're enjoying this content so far. So I'm going to ask you this question: 12 Mac Minis or 4 Mac Studios? Which do you think is better? So as I mentioned previously, my project requires 24 gigs of RAM. We can make that work on the Mac Mini, but it's, not the most efficient solution. So when I start installing build agents on each one of these Mac Minis, I'm not going to break them up into smaller machines. I'm going to leave them as 1 machine each. So for the exact same amount of space on a server rack, I can support up to 12 build agents when using Mac Minis. And again, I won't have enough RAM to really properly compile the project. Or if I switch over to the Mac Studio setup, I only have 4 machines, 20 build agents, and enough RAM to build my project. So the difference there is pretty clear. I get 12 agents on one side and 20 on the other. This is significant, especially for any of you who are actually doing the maintenance for CI/CD systems. You've got 4 machines that you have to update security systems on, tooling, and all that kind of stuff, versus 12. Your failover is actually pretty nice too, so if one of your Mac Studios goes down, you still have 15 build agents, versus the 12 you had before with 12 independent Mac Minis. Okay, so let's start throwing some money down. The Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra chip, 128 gigs of RAM, and a 1 terabyte SSD is $4,799. If I multiply that by 4 to fill up my server rack, that's $19,196. Whereas the M1 Mac Mini with 16 gigs of RAM and 1 terabyte of SSD space is $1,299. If I multiply that by 12 to fill up my rack space, that's $15,588. That's a difference of $3,600. Now for $3,600, when you consider the overhead of updating machines and taking them in when they're broken, which do you think an engineering department is going to choose? And here's the other thing with the Mac Studio system. If our project ever decides to grow larger, which it inevitably will, we can always knock down the number of build agents we have and thus allocate more memory to each build agent for our project. That's going to let us scale for quite a while. And when your project is dealing with this much memory overhead, there just isn't any more scaling you can do when you're stuck with the M1 Mac Mini. Everything about these new Mac Studios is great for the next generation of mobile app development. Let me know if your mobile organization is considering making the switch. Like always, I super appreciate spending this time with you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.